In 1940, the world was on fire. The American military watched from the sidelines as a new kind of mechanized warfare swept across Europe and realized they were desperately unprepared. In the summer of 1940, America was a nation holding its breath, while the storms of war gathered and broke across Europe and Asia. Here, life continued with a fragile sense of normalcy. The industrial might of the United States was stirring, but not yet fully awake to the conflict that would soon define the age. The U.S. Army, however, was growing increasingly alarmed. Its fleet of vehicles was a relic of a bygone era. The primary reconnaissance vehicles were often motorcycles, which proved ill-suited to rough terrain, and modified Ford Model Ts, which lacked the durability and four-wheel drive needed for the modern battlefield. Observing the blitzkrieg in Europe, Army officials knew they needed something new, something light, tough, capable of carrying a few soldiers and a machine gun that could scramble over nearly any obstacle. They needed a universal vehicle for a new kind of war. On July 11, 1940, the Army sent its formal request. The list of specifications was daunting. It had to have four-wheel drive, a wheelbase of no more than 80 inches, and weigh no more than 1,300 pounds. But the most audacious requirement was a timeline. A working prototype had to be delivered for testing in just 49 days. The request went out to 135 American manufacturers. The response was nearly universal silence. The major automakers were busy with existing civilian production and lucrative defense contracts. The timeline was seen as impossible, the weight target unachievable. All of them declined. All but one. The only company to formally accept the challenge was the American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania. Bantam was a successor to the American Austin Car Company, known for making tiny, fuel-efficient cars. By 1940, the company was operating in bankruptcy, and its workforce was down to a skeleton crew. Bantam had the will, but not the engineering staff to design the vehicle from scratch in time. So the company's president contacted a freelance automotive designer in Detroit named Carl Probst. Initially, Probst turned the job down, citing the impossible deadline. But the Army, desperate for a bidder, appealed to his patriotism and agreed to pay him for his time after he started. On July 17, 1940, Carl Probst walked into Bantam's offices and began work, with the clock already ticking. Working without pay at first, Probst laid out the full design for the new vehicle in just 2 days. He knew the 1,300-pound weight limit was unrealistic if the vehicle was to be durable, and wisely designed to a more robust and heavier standard from the start. He and a small team at Bantam then worked around the clock, sourcing off-the-shelf drivetrain components and fabricating the chassis. On September 23, 1940, with just 30 minutes to spare before the final deadline, Bantam's prototype rolled into the Army's testing grounds at Camp Holabird, Maryland. It was a small, rugged, unadorned vehicle, nicknamed the Blitz Buggy, and later designated the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC. It had arrived. It worked. The Army testers were impressed. The little car exceeded most of the Army's specifications, though it did come in over the initial weight limit. As Probst had predicted, the Bantam prototype was tough, nimble, and did everything asked of it. It was a triumph of ingenuity and grit. Bantam had met the impossible challenge. They had designed the template for what would become one of the most famous vehicles in history. It should have been the company's salvation. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. The Army had its design, but it had a serious problem. The Bantam factory in Butler was tiny, and its finances were precarious. There was no way it could produce the tens of thousands of vehicles the Army knew it would need if America went to war. The Army needed industrial might that Bantam simply did not possess. During Bantam's frantic 49-day sprint, 2 other companies had been watching with interest: Willys-Overland of Toledo, Ohio, and the industrial titan, Ford Motor Company. They had initially passed on the tight deadline, but now that Bantam had proven a vehicle could be built, they were eager to get involved. In a move that remains controversial to this day, the Army declared Bantam's design to be government property. It then actively encouraged Willys and Ford to develop their own prototypes, giving them access to Bantam's blueprints and the BRC prototype itself for inspection. Willys-Overland, another company that had faced financial struggles, saw a lifeline. Their engineers quickly developed their own pilot model, which they called the Quad. It was heavier than the Bantam, largely due to one key feature the company refused to compromise on. That feature was its engine. The Willys Go Devil engine was significantly more powerful than the unit used in the Bantam prototype. It produced 60 horsepower, giving the Willys Quad a clear performance advantage that the Army evaluators immediately noticed. Meanwhile, Ford developed its own prototype, known as the Pygmy. While its engine was less powerful than the Willys, Ford brought its unmatched expertise in mass production to the table. The Pygmy also introduced several design innovations, including the iconic flat, stamped grille with vertical slots. By November 1940, the Army had all three prototypes undergoing tests. The Willys Quad was the most powerful. The Ford Pygmy showed the best manufacturing innovations, and the Bantam BRC was the original, the lightest, and still a nimble performer. The stage was set for a final decision. The Army decided to order a pre-production run of 1,500 vehicles from each of three companies for further field testing. Bantam produced the BRC-40. Willys produced the Willys MB, an evolution of their Quad, and Ford produced a GP, a refined version of their Pygmy. The Willys MB featured a gear shift on the steering column and a heavy, welded slat grille to protect its radiator. Many of these early MAs were sent to Allied forces, including the Soviet Union, under the Lend-Lease program. Bantam, in a last-ditch effort to win the contract, produced over 2,600 of its BRC-40 model. But the company's fate was already sealed. Its small size and financial instability were hurdles it could not overcome in the eyes of the Army's logisticians. In July 1941, almost exactly a year after the initial request, the Army made its final choice. Willys-Overland was awarded the contract to build the first 16,000 vehicles. The decisive factor was its powerful Go Devil engine, combined with a lower bid. This new, standardized vehicle was to be called the Model MB. It would incorporate the best features of all three contenders. It took the powerful and reliable 60-horsepower engine from the Willys MB, and from the Ford GP, it adopted the lighter, cheaper, and easier-to-manufacture stamped steel front grille, though Willys modified it from Ford's 13 slots to 9. The basic layout and chassis design remained remarkably true to Carl Probst's original Bantam concept. For American Bantam, the company that started it all, there was no grand prize. After its run of BRC-40s, the company spent the rest of the war building heavy-duty trailers for the Army. It never produced another car, and the company faded into history after the war. And what of the name? Jeep. Its exact origin is debated. Many believe it's a slurring of the letters GP, the designation Ford used for its prototype. Others point to a popular character from the Popeye cartoons, Eugene the Jeep, a magical creature who could go anywhere and solve any problem. Whatever its source, the name stuck. Willys-Overland began mass production of the MB model. The little car that couldn't be built was about to become the vehicle that would help win the war. With the design finalized as the Willys MB, the American war machine had its vehicle. It was a brilliant synthesis. The layout from Bantam, the engine from Willys, and manufacturing efficiencies from Ford. But as the United States was drawn inexorably closer to war, a new problem emerged: scale. Willys-Overland had won the coveted contract, but the initial order for 16,000 units was just the beginning. The Army projected a need for hundreds of thousands. The factory in Toledo, while capable, simply could not meet that colossal demand alone. The War Production Board needed a second source, and it turned to the one company with unparalleled experience in mass production, the Ford Motor Company. Ford was given a license to build the Willys-designed vehicle. Ford's version was designated the GPW. The G stood for government contract, the P designated its 80-inch wheelbase, and the W was a crucial acknowledgement of the Willys license design. The Army's single most important requirement for this dual sourcing was total parts interchangeability. A part from a Ford-built GPW had to fit perfectly on a Willys-built MB, and vice versa. This was critical for frontline maintenance. Ford, fiercely proud of its own brand, is said to have marked nearly every single component of its GPW with a script F logo. With Ford's industrial power added to Willis's, production exploded. Together, the two companies would build approximately 640,000 Jeeps during the war. Willys produced around 360,000 MBs, while Ford added nearly 280,000 GPWs. From a single prototype delivered with minutes to spare, the Jeep had become an unstoppable river of steel, flowing from the heart of American industry to every corner of the globe. The Jeep went everywhere. It served with every branch of the U.S. military and was a vital part of the Lend-Lease program, equipping Allied armies around the world, from the British and Commonwealth forces to the Soviet Red Army. Its impact was not lost on the war's leaders. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, would later call it one of the three tools that won the war. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, described it as America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. The vehicle's genius was its simplicity and versatility. It was small enough to be loaded into a glider for airborne operations, yet tough enough to handle the world's worst roads, or no roads at all. Its lightweight and four-wheel drive gave it mobility that heavier trucks could only dream of. It was a scout car, a command vehicle, a communications post, and an ambulance. It laid telephone wire, served as a light tractor for artillery pieces, and, when fitted with a machine gun, became a nimble and aggressive weapons platform. With its windshield folded down, the Jeep presented an incredibly low silhouette, making it harder for enemies to spot. It was a workhorse, a weapon, and a symbol of American ingenuity and resolve. But for all its go-anywhere ability on land, there was one domain the standard Jeep could not conquer: water. In the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific and the river-rich battlefields of Europe, the Army saw a need for a vehicle that could swim. The task of creating an amphibious Jeep fell to Ford, in partnership with the yacht design firm Sparkman and Stevens. The result, introduced in 1942, was a Ford GPA. The A stood for amphibious. It quickly earned the nickname Seep for Sea Jeep. The Seep was essentially a GPW wrapped in a watertight steel hull. It used the same engine and four-wheel drive system, but added a propeller at the rear and a rudder for steering, both powered by a power takeoff unit. On paper, it was the perfect solution. In reality, it was a master of no trade. On land, the boat hull made it heavy, cumbersome, and slower than a standard Jeep. In the water, it was underpowered and suffered from a very low freeboard, meaning it was easily swamped by waves or a chop. The U.S. Army used the GPA during the invasion of Sicily, but its poor performance in the coastal waves led them to largely sideline the vehicle. Production was halted in 1943 after just over 12,700 units had been built. But this wasn't the end of the Seep story. A significant number were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. On the Eastern Front, with its vast network of rivers and fewer open-sea operations, the GPA found its niche. The Red Army used it effectively for reconnaissance and for leading bridgehead assaults across rivers. While specialized variants like the Seep had mixed success, the standard Jeep was an unqualified triumph. It carried generals and privates, medics and mechanics. It became a fixture in every photograph, a witness to every major battle, and a beloved icon to the soldiers who depended on it. As the war drew to a close, Willys-Overland looked to the future. They knew the government contracts would soon end, but they also knew they were in possession of one of the most famous and respected brand names in the world, forged in the crucible of global conflict. The question was, could the little vehicle that helped win the war find a new life in a world at peace? The transition from the barracks to the barn was about to begin. In 1945, as victory bells rang out across the world, millions of soldiers began the long journey home. They brought with them memories of the camaraderie, the hardship, and the tools that had kept them going. One of those tools, the Jeep, had earned a place of honor in the hearts of nearly every GI. At Willys-Overland in Toledo, the end of the war meant the end of massive government contracts. The company's president, Charles Sorensen, a former Ford executive, saw a unique opportunity. He believed the Jeep's wartime fame could be translated into civilian success. Even before the war was over, Willys began experimenting with a civilian version. The first prototypes, logically named the CJ-1 and CJ-2, were essentially modified military MBs. They were used for testing and to gauge public interest. These early models were nicknamed agri-Jeeps, signaling Willis's intended market, America's farmers. The company planned to pitch the vehicle not as a car, but as a revolutionary piece of farm equipment, a replacement for the tractor and the workhorse. After refining the design based on these prototypes, Willys launched the first mass-produced civilian Jeep for the 1946 model year. It was called the CJ2A. The CJ stood simply for Civilian Jeep. While it looked very similar to its military parent, the CJ2A had several key modifications for civilian life. The most obvious was the addition of a tailgate, a feature the military MB lacked. The spare tire was moved from the rear to the side, and the fuel filler cap was relocated from under the driver's seat to the outside of the body. These were small but significant changes for convenience and safety. The headlights grew larger and were integrated flush into front fenders, a stark contrast to the smaller, recessed lights of the MB. And most iconically, the 9-slot stamped grille of the wartime Jeep was replaced by a new design with 7 slots. This 7-slot grille will become a registered trademark and a defining feature of the Jeep brand for decades to come. Mechanically, the CJ2A retained the trusty Go Devil engine, but it was made into a more robust Borg-Warner T90 transmission. Early production models, often called Very Early Civilian or VC, are known to have used a mix of leftover surplus parts from military MB production. Willys marketed the CJ2A as a universal Jeep. Advertisements pitched it as a mobile power source that could do the work of 2 draft horses. With an optional power takeoff or PTO, it could run everything from a buzz saw to a thresher before driving the family into town on Saturday night. It was a compelling pitch to a rural America that was mechanizing rapidly after the war. The CJ2A was a success, with over 214,000 units produced between 1945 and 1949. The Jeep had found its new mission. In 1949, Willys introduced the next evolution of civilian Jeep, the CJ3A. It was a subtle but significant update. The most noticeable change was a replacement of the 2-piece split windshield with a new 1-piece design that featured a ventilation flap at the base. The CJ3A offered a bit more comfort and refinement, with more legroom and an updated instrument cluster. It continued to be marketed heavily to the agricultural sector, but its appeal was broadening. It was still powered by the reliable L134 Go Devil engine. Willys produced nearly 132,000 CJ3As, but by the early 1950s, the market was changing. The post-war boom was in full swing, and customers were beginning to demand more power. The venerable Go Devil engine, a design rooted in the 1930s, was nearing the end of its potential. The answer arrived in 1953 with the introduction of the Willys CJ3B. The CJ3B is instantly recognizable for one feature: its tall, prominent hood and grille. This wasn't just a styling choice. It was a change born of pure necessity. Willys needed to fit its new, more powerful engine into the Jeep. This was the F134 or Hurricane engine. It used a clever F-head design with the intake valves in the head and the exhaust valves in the block. This allowed for much larger valves and dramatically improved engine breathing and power output. The new engine produced 75 horsepower, a 25% increase over the Go Devil. But there was a problem. It was taller. It simply wouldn't fit under the low hood of the CJ3A. The solution was as simple as it was distinctive: raise the hood and grille to make room. And so, the high hood Jeep was born. The introduction of the CJ3B coincided with another major change. In 1953, the struggling Kaiser Frazer Corporation purchased Willys-Overland, renaming the company Willys Motors. For the first time, the Jeep was in the hands of a new corporate parent. The CJ3B, with its powerful and reliable Hurricane engine, had an incredibly long life. While it was eventually superseded by newer models in the U.S. market, it was built under license for decades in countries around the world, a testament to the durability of its design. From a desperate scribble on a drafting board in 1940, to the battlefields of the Second World War, to the farms and fields of a peaceful nation, the journey of the original Jeep was complete. It began as an answer to an impossible question. It was born from the ambition of a tiny company: given its heart by one competitor and its industrial might by another. It proved its toughness in war and its usefulness in peace. It was a vehicle that became a tool that became a weapon, and a weapon that became an enduring global icon. If this story moved you, as it did for us, take a moment to hit that like button. Every like helps us bring these forgotten heroes back into the light and share their legacy with more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing you stories from the past, from the battlefield to World War II, every time we share a new chapter. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, whether it's the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else around the world. Our community is global, and your voice is part of keeping these stories alive. We want to hear from you, whether the connection to someone who served, a personal story, or just a simple thank you to those who gave everything. You're not just a viewer. You're a part of preserving this history. Thank you for helping ensure these stories, these men and women, are never forgotten. Their bravery deserves to live on, and with your support, we're making sure that happens.